Good afternoon, everybody, or evening, whenever somebody's maybe listening to this podcast. This afternoon, I'm having a chat with Joel Williams, and it's all about soils and how soils can help you on your farm. Soil really is the foundation of all life on Earth. Everything really depends on it, and sometimes it is often overlooked. And with all the changes in land use, intensification of agriculture and climate change, all these things influence our soils more, and it all has a massive impact on the growth of the crops, which then obviously impacts the growth of the animals which are eating those crops. So hopefully Joel can give us some of his expert knowledge this afternoon and give us thoughts, opinions for you to think of and digest as to what you can do with your overall farm. So first of all, Joel, if you can maybe just give the audience a bit of a background to who you are and what you do.
Sure thing. So my business is Integrated Soils, and through that I primarily offer independent education. So that's, speaking at conferences, running workshops and seminars and webinars and all of that educational related material. And that's my main focus. And that's certainly my main passion. I'm very passionate about education. I believe that, education is a real agent for change. And it certainly helped me a lot in my life. If I look back in my youth, and I'll be honest, I wasn't super academic when I was a kid. I was a bit naughty and whatnot. So as a lot of us were in our youth. But education, I think, really helped me. So I place a lot of value in its importance. So I feel very lucky to be doing this now and primarily doing that educational piece, helping farmers with their changing of their soils and their management, etc. And so that's primarily what I do. But beyond that, I do a little bit of consulting as well, both, again, a bit of virtual remote consulting, but also on farm and also with some other industry and that kind of thing. So, but really, it's all about a focus around soils as a central topic, as we're going to talk about today. But, once we start talking about soils, lots of other things branch out from there. We can't talk about soils without also talking about plants and plant nutrition, pastures, and then animal health, grazing management, all of those other pieces that then fit into that broader picture. As you mentioned in your introduction there, soils, they are the basis, they are the foundation of life on terrestrial ecosystems. So obviously they therefore are of fundamental importance, both from that ecological productivity point of view, but equally from any farming business. It is the foundation of their entire business.
I know you're in Canada now, but where did you grow up and how did you get into soils and become an expert in soils?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Australia, and I took an interest in soils when I was a teenager, Odd. That was about that transition where I started becoming a bit more focused in schoolwork and things. And I would say I got into growing vegetables. It became just a weekend hobby thing for me back in Australia. And that was really what kicked it off. It was through taking an interest in growing vegetables that I took an interest in then all things growing related, compost and soils. And so through school, by the time I finished secondary school, high school, I decided that that's what I wanted to do, is go and study soil and agriculture. And so, for me, that was a long time ago. That was a good 30 odd years ago. And at that time, talking about soils and things, as I then moved on and went to university, and I studied agricultural science at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, where I'm from. And certainly at that time in my early 20s, I would tell people that I was studying soil and the soil was my thing. And at that time, I'd get funny looks and raised eyebrows. It was an odd thing. If you ask probably anybody who did some form of agricultural studies, soils had a real reputation, I think, for being quite a dry and boring topic amongst, other agricultural students who might have been there to study, some other aspect, maybe animal nutrition or other aspects of crop management and agronomy. But things have really changed in these last 20 years, I guess. Soils are such a hot topic now. So it's good to see that total reversal. But I do remember back at that time, it was an odd topic to be studying and to be interested in. But for me, that inlet really came all through growing first. And from there, I took that interest and just ran with it from there. So it was all thanks to growing vegetables.
Do you still grow vegetables now?
I do. I find it a little bit harder with managing in my garden with the amount of travel that I do. So that's the challenge I face now. And I have a very, very shady back garden. I have like 9 trees in there. So So yeah, I still do a bit of growing. I have 2 beautiful cherry trees in the back garden and just some other native plant pines and things. But I have a little small patch where I get a little bit of sun, and yeah, I grow a few things there, some herbs, and it's just a bit of a small basic garden these days. But yeah, I'm still very interested. And through my career, even after that hobby, I worked on farms in the UK there. I was working on a mixed farm that also had a walled garden and used to produce vegetables and livestock and grassland and other things too. But that was part of their operation. And for a while there, I did a stint in London working at a university, which was also really doing some market gardening, growing vegetables on the university campus. So it's something that I've still dabbled in a little bit on and off, in and out over these years. So yeah, when I find the time, I definitely still like to get my hands dirty, that's for sure.
And do you think for both beef and sheep farmers, if they improve their soils on their farm, will that influence both profitability and the carbon footprint?
Definitely. And this is true for all farmers. That's the very universal thing about soil, and then these topics around soil health or soil carbon. They are very much unifying themes for all farmers to get on board with and have these conversations about. So I think, again, that's another big change that we're seeing now with this emergence of the whole soil health kind of broad discussion, that it's a lot of farmers are coming together, are coalescing around this important topic and trying to understand how better to manage their soils, how better to improve those soils and optimize them for both farm productivity and, of course, profitability. Yeah, definitely. For, then in a grazing context, graziers have this natural advantage compared to, say, an arable cropping or vegetable situation, which is that they have these perennial plants. They have perennial pastures and they have their livestock. They have that interaction between pastures and animal. And that system of farming means that, some of those soil health principles are automatically being followed. For example, minimizing disturbance. There's not as much cultivations, of course, in a permanent pasture type scenario. And then in terms of that all important living roots soil health principle, keeping that soil covered is also ticked, but also then the living roots one. And it is the fact that under a perennial-based, pasture-based system that we keep that soil covered with permanent green cover, and those living roots means that those roots are always turning over, growing and dying, growing, dying. We have some of that photosynthetic carbon being sent down and released out of those roots as those root exudates. And so all of this really ultimately means that there's this much more constant and steady flow of carbon down into the soil in a pasture-based system. And that's, of course, why, as all your listeners know very well, we typically do always find more soil organic matter, higher soil organic matter in a pasture-based system, in a grassland, than we do in a cropland. And that's really that point there, that they, by default, through the nature of the production system, they're already following some of those soil health principles, and we are keeping carbon levels up. So they do have a natural advantage, just to say that up front. But just because they have more carbon in those soils doesn't always mean that carbon is functional, is active, or as functional as it could be. And that there's definitely important nuance around the grazing management that, of course, those graziers need to be managing in terms of optimizing that soil health for the productivity gain. So that's where, the important things around good rotational grazing practices and good rest periods, this becomes very important to ensure that those pastures have the chance to grow those deeper roots down into that soil, where they can then be more active and functional in that soil, turning that soil over. And I think grassland soils, they can have a tendency still to suffer from compaction. Compaction, I think, is quite a universal problem in many parts of the world, but I think particularly in the UK, even though it's a minimized disturbance system, even though there's permanent soil cover, there is the livestock interaction there. And in your very, very wet climate, some of those soils are also still quite prone to compaction. So again, this is where that importance of that grazing management is key, to encourage roots to grow down, to help with that restructuring of that soil, to keep that soil open, create those channels and tunnels for good soil structure. So I think that how a grazier approaches this discussion of soil health and how to improve soil carbon is a little different, but nonetheless, it's both universally important across all cropping types. And of course, more soil carbon is going to improve the function of that soil. And when we improve the function of that soil, well, of course, that's going to improve the productivity and therefore improve the profitability. So these things are all very much intertwined, absolutely. And I think it is equally as important for graziers, despite having a bit of a natural advantage with their baseline soil carbon levels, it's still something that they need to be mindful and thinking of in terms of the management, yes.
And where would a farmer, if they weren't really sure how good the soils were, where's the best thing to start? Should they be looking at digging holes? Should they be looking at taking soil tests themselves or getting somebody in to do soil tests? What would your advice be? Or could it be a mixture of all?
Yeah, it would be a bit of a mixture, but I think I would start with some in-field assessments. It's going to cost you nothing initially, and there's a lot you can tell just with the spade and some time and some footprints out in the field. And I think that the broader answer to your question is that, and that's kind of what we see in these discussions around the soil health assessments these days, is that what they're trying to do is to say, well, look, traditionally we have been very focused on the soil's chemical properties, a handful of the nutrients and the pH. And of course, yes, those are really, really important. But we also need to think about the soil's physical properties, the structure, and we also need to think about the biological properties, the life in the soil. And so that's really the modern kind of representation of some of these soil health assessments, is this idea of saying, well, we need to take a bit of a broader snapshot and say, I've got to measure some of the chemical properties, some of the physical properties, some of the biological properties, and we'll integrate those together into one larger overview of soil health assessment. Now, so that then statement can hold true both in terms of soils we send off to a lab who can give us some information about all three of those, but also some basic things we can do in the field. So I would start in the field. I think, doing some of those things around looking at the soil's infiltration rate. And again, farmers can find lots of resources online on how to do some of these tests on YouTube and things as well. But, some of those basic things like doing an infiltration test, that tells us about the soil's physical condition. We could also do a spade test and have a little look at the structure and the aggregates and that kind of thing in that soil. But that's giving us a snapshot into the physical condition. And that's, again, really, really important for those other reasons that we talked about earlier. Then we could do other things like smell the soil, maybe do earthworm counts. These are giving us a little bit of an indication around the biological activity of the soil and that kind of thing. So I would start with some of those basic kind of field-based assessments. There's many of those that you can kind of do, but I think that they are a good starting place. And really, when doing those, to kind of calibrate these assessments or to give them context, it's really, I think, valuable to obviously choose a few different fields or choose a relative comparison, choose two different areas, and A and a B. Well, here's a good performing part of this field. Here's a poor performing part. This part doesn't drain very well. There always is ponding, something like this, or this field does well and this field doesn't perform well. I think it's when we do some of those relative comparisons between A and B, that's where it can be a very, very useful in-field test, because right there, you can do baselining and that kind of thing over time, and that's all good too. And there's, some great apps like the Soil Mentor app and things to kind of track some of those things for you over time these days. But I think that what's very powerful is putting two different samples, right in front of your sensors right there at the same time and saying, okay, well, this soil looks like this one looks like this. What is the management over here? What is the management over there? What do we need to maybe think about learning from this, and what can we bring over, and what management can we apply to improve the poorer soil? So I think those relative comparisons are super valuable when working with some of those in-field assessments. And then otherwise, yeah, it's then a combination of some of the lab stuff. There are some things that the lab can test that we can't do in the field. So, a bit of a deeper dive into some of those nutrient levels, for example, and some of the biological microorganisms and things which are a bit hard to measure unless we have a microscope. So my kind of summary there is I think a combination of both, as well as a bit of the chemistry, physics, and biology.
Okay. And do you think if you need to do some changes to the field and address any issues, do you need to address the likes of compaction before you'd start looking at any of the deficiencies in the field, or does it not really matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's probably multiple different ways to think about this one, or many different schools of thought on this one. And it's a tricky one because it starts, when we phrase the question like that, it starts to pigeonhole the problems to say, oh, well, I must do this first before I do this. And I think there are some good examples where that is the case. And that really represents that idea of saying, well, what is my biggest limiting factor? What is the biggest constraint here? This is the one I need to unblock first, and then we could move on to, some of the other ones. And I think that's a very fair rationale. Part of the idea of kind of that more holistic thinking around soil health is to say that, well, there are probably multiple entry points to problems, and to strategies in terms of fixing that soil, working on and changing that soil health. that's that idea of an integrated approach. It says, well, we're going to integrate many strategies and use many levers to try and nudge that soil in the right direction. So as much as I could agree and say, well, look, if the soil is absolutely compacted, really tight and compacted, well, of course, the nutrients that the chemistry that is there, the nutrients that is there, they're not going to actually be able to be available. They're not going to be accessed, and they're not going to be able to be unlocked if the soil is so tight and compact that the roots can't even get to them. So I think that is right to say that there is a certain level of a hierarchy there, but I think more broadly, it's a good idea to say, well, look, I'm going to attack at many different points all at the same time, and they're all going to do a bit of that heavy lifting, and that's going to help to kind of turn that wheel over time. I do place quite a high regard on the essence of your question around soil compaction. And, I've seen it lots in the UK, and I've often talked about this. You guys have this very wet climate, and there's that high rainfall environment. And if you have poor infiltration, then that water starts sitting on the soil. And when that water is standing and sitting on that soil, that's an inch or two of water can actually be a lot of weight pressing down. And I think soil compaction is rather systemic in a UK context. It seems to be very prevalent. But, just in these last 2 years, I've had a lot of travel these last 2 years especially. And you know what, actually, compaction, for very different reasons, but compaction is quite a universal thing. I've been to Australia twice this year for about 6 weeks or so each time. And there's also huge problems there with compaction as well. And it's a very, kind of different reasons, a bit more of a chemical compaction, low pH, high aluminium, some of these types of things that can lead to chemical tightness of the soil. So I do think that compaction is a really central problem and that all farmers need to kind of think about. And yes, you're right to say that, well, look, if the physical condition of the soil is suboptimal, it's going to be hard to get oxygen and gas exchange into that soil. And therefore, that's going to be hard for those soils to breathe, to help the soil biology function. And again, equally, like we said before, if the soil is compact, it's going to be hard for roots to penetrate and then just acquire the chemistry and get the nutrients. So that's where I think that in-field indicator of the infiltration test, as simple as that is, just doing a quick infiltration test, it tells us actually quite a lot about the soils, because if we haven't got that infiltration right, if we haven't got some element of okay soil structure, both of those other things are not going to function very well. So I do place this one quite highly, but as a general answer, I would still say I think there is a need to kind of think about using multiple levers and nudging the soil along at multiple different entry points and various different strategies all at once.
And would your advice be different depending on the soil conditions or the soil type? It is, as you say, it is raining again in the UK today, or where I am. So would the advice be different depending on the soil conditions or the type of the soil?
Yeah, definitely. There's a bit of two halves to this answer. On one hand, there's, of course, soils, as you know, even in the UK, in such a small country, there's huge variability in soil types in a relatively speaking small country. And then when you move up to, larger countries, well, obviously they equally have huge variability in soil types as well. So that's actually from my experience, that's just a universal thing. So all countries have really diverse soil types, even across sometimes relatively smaller areas. So yeah, of course, there does have to be subtleties around that in terms of the different approach or different management action that you would use for those different soil types. But I would also just stress that that's somewhat of a universal thing to having these variable soil types. So every country kind of has to deal with this. And across that variability, there are some universal soil properties that are important irrespective of the soil type. And some of those kind of obvious examples would be, again, something like soil carbon or the soil pH, for example, would be another one. These are important no matter what your soil type is, no matter kind of where your context is, where you are in the landscape. So there are some kind of those, I guess, low-hanging fruit and some of those basics that are universal, and everybody, maybe there are common strategies that all soils might be deployed in those various different soil types, irrespective. But then beyond that, yes, of course, when you're dealing with a clay soil versus a sandy soil, I mean, they literally are a bit chalk and cheese, and the management that comes with those has to be different. So, obviously a sandy soil, it's going to need a lot more of a spoon feeding approach. We have to be careful about over swamping that, overloading that with any inputs, the soil just can't hold on to those. So they're going to flush through. So, taking a more lighter approach of spoon feeding on lighter sandy soils becomes one example that is very different in how that you would manage that versus a clay soil, for example. So yeah, I think there's some common things that are universal, but of course, definitely different soil types need different management. And then, of course, even the economics and the context around that. Well, what is that soil being used for? So what is the production system? Is it for grassland? Is it for cropping? What are the economics around those two outputs, those two crops or those two productive outputs? And therefore, what are the priorities in terms of management, based on also the economic considerations of what the production system is? So we can't also divorce out the economics either. It's got to be practical, it's got to work, it's got to fit. Farmers need to be able to apply the recommendations or the strategies. They've got to be able to integrate them. That's part of, that process of doing a bit of consultation. Here's a selection of options, pathways in which we could kind of work on. Maybe some of those strategies are not relevant for some particular farms. They just don't have the equipment or, the skills or whatever to do certain things. So in that regard, it's really about meeting in the middle of saying, well, here's options for remediation. Let's find the ones that work best in that context for that farmer with that soil type and in that production system and those economics kind of thing. So it's, yes, definitely you need to fine tune those on a case by case scenario.
I know when people get soil tests back, and probably different companies, it's probably different metrics that they're given, but sometimes there's just sort of so many different elements and metrics to look at. It can be a bit daunting and confusing, I guess, for the farmer. What are the key ones that you say, if you're only going to look at a couple of them so you don't get too bogged down with all these numbers, what are the key ones that people should be looking at?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, isn't it? And you're right.
I like to be tricky.
Yes. And it is a really good question. It is a really tough question because I totally agree with the underlying premise of your question that soil tests are very confusing. There are so many variables, that there are so many metrics and things to measure. It's not easy to interpret a soil test. And I think that some of the labs, they do help. They provide, some guidelines, a target range, so you can at least see if your number or your result is high or low, for example. I think that helps a lot, obviously, because you can visually see, okay, well, here's where I'm supposed to be, here's where I am. Some labs I've seen, soil tests from all around the world, and often some labs, it's literally just some numbers on a page, without any kind of guideline or any target range. It becomes very difficult to interpret what does that number mean, what should it be, and to then, plot a course of action from there. So I think some of the labs these days, they do provide the numbers in a bit more of a user-friendly format with some nice kind of graphs or high or low type readings. That certainly helps a lot cut through some of this muddiness. But to the core of your question, it's a really hard one to answer because, I can give a few general kind of comments here. I can give a few general answers, but it is going to depend always. There's always context, and I could cheat and answer, say, well, the most important things to look out for are the ones that are the biggest limitations, the things that are your biggest limitation, and your biggest constraint or limitation is going to be different to another farmer, on the other side of the country, for example. So the most important things are the things that are most limiting or imbalanced. There could, I say limiting, it could be that there's an excess of something that's causing a problem as well. So it really depends on the soil, and therefore it's hard to give generalized figures about this. And of course it depends on the crop type and that kind of thing too. But I would maybe just a few small general comments. I think that, we're all talking about soil carbon these days, soil organic matter. And of course, it is a really, really important aspect to the soil's function. And it's one that is I think, often a bit harder because it's not, if you see that it's low or if it's high, it's not like an automatic knee-jerk reaction that says, oh, well, if something is limiting, I have to apply it. Yeah, we can try and apply organic manures and composts and amendments to try and build that carbon, but it's a slow game. And of course, we don't have to be applying organic amendments. We could try and build soil organic matter through better root growth, through better production, in terms of better management of that soil. So growing soil organic matter in situ through plant growth. but it's a long-term game. So my point being, it's not as one of these easy, like, oh, well, okay, I have a trace mineral deficiency, I need to apply something and address it. I have a nutrient deficiency, I have to address it. It's really more of a long-term game of saying, well, okay, how do I lift my soil organic matters over time? And therefore, because it's a longer-term game, I think some farmers often might look at their soil carbon levels and think, well, there's not a lot I can do in the immediate term, in the immediate short term. So it could be a bit lower down the priority of its importance. I mean, yes, we all understand it's important, but in terms of the management action, the immediate management action, it's one of those ones that's a little bit lower. And that's a tricky trap, I think, to fall into because, as all of your listeners will be well aware, the more soil organic matter that we have, it is a really important, it is a very central property of the soil that does influence all three of the chemistry, the physics, and the biology. So it is something that is of fundamental importance and should be very high in that priority for farmers. But I think it's one that often is down the lower just because of the time scale of which we try to work on it. I would stress, I think that one's important, and that does influence, again, the physical, the biological, the chemical. So that's why it's, particularly important. And I do place, a lot of emphasis also, there's 100 ways to answer this question really, but something like also calcium. I know that we often talk about pH, and we'll often apply lime or amendments to optimize the soil pH, and of course that is important, but I would also stress it's important to look at calcium supply for the soil, for calcium, not for pH, but to make sure that the soil has adequate calcium, because calcium is one of those nutrients that also helps to influence the soil's physical condition through flocculation. It's a nutrient that helps to kind of open up the soil structure and chemically improve the soil structure. So I would put that one quite high as well on my priority list, just I think particularly in a UK context where it can help a little bit with some of the soil structural. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but it can help with some of the soil structural problems that are prevalent in the UK through better chemical opening up of that soil, which then is going to help those roots and better pasture management, grazing management and everything to then do that job. But it's going to kind of help trigger that along a little bit. So I would put calcium probably higher than most others. The standard UK system is PKMG, pH PKMG. So we don't even often look at calcium apart from every now and then if we want to address the pH. But I would just stress that it's an important nutrient both for the soil and for the plant health as well. And so it's one that I would kind of also pretty high. And then as a general rule, I also put high value on all of the trace elements. I think trace elements are very important, and a lot of farmers also neglect those because they don't always give such a big visual response from their application, but they can very much influence the quality of that produce, the health of the plant and the quality of that feed or grain or whatever it is their farmers are growing. I would also emphasize, I think that trace elements are a little bit undervalued and should be looked at maybe a little more closely than they traditionally are. That's my fumble through that answer to that question. It's a really hard one I think it really depends on the context. You've got to see the soil numbers. You've got to talk to the farmer. You've got to understand what their system is. And then you're better able to kind of pinpoint maybe what the most critical things are.
So they're all important, but possibly different for different people, depending on what fields they're looking at and what cropping they're doing or
exactly.
Those sorts of different things. We did a case study with a farmer recently who said they have been incorporating wool into their land to aid in the nitrogen content of the soils. It was making the crops put their roots down further to get to that nitrogen supply, which was obviously helping them in drought times and through extended different weather patterns that we're having. Have you got any experience of people incorporating wool into their soils?
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? At the end of the day, it is an organic amendment, organic material, and incorporating that into the soil. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me to hear that they were seeing those types of benefits. It is made of keratin, there's protein in that wool. So that's going to break down to form amino acids and break down to form organic nitrogen. It's going to have a little bit of fertilizer value, so to speak, but also it's going to have lots of carbon in there, and it's going to be a bit of an organic amendment for that soil. So it seems a bit of a waste to be putting nice, beautiful wool into the soil, but I understand the economics around the price of wool is yeah, then it doesn't sound so crazy when you think of it in that context. So it makes sense. And I'm interested to hear that that was their kind of feedback, and that's kind of some of the benefits that they saw. Because one of the things that I'm also quite, and for some of your listeners that are aware of some of my work and things, is that I focus a lot on things like nitrogen management, particularly the role of organic sources of nitrogen like amino acids, and how these are very valuable sources of nitrogen for plant growth and development. And through that interest of mine, I've done a lot of work and reading into this topic of protein hydrolysates. So taking high protein materials that could be a waste material and digesting those, enzymatically breaking those down and digesting those back down into the raw amino acids, into the constituent amino acids, and making kind of upcycled fertilizers from this. So, one of the kind of the really common examples is things like a fish hydrolysate, where you can take fish wastes and fish frames and that kind of thing. And there's lots of proteins in there. And so you can digest those back into those amino acids and then make liquid fertilizers, liquid organic nitrogen fertilizers from these amino acids. So I've done a lot of work into the research into this space, and there's all sorts of agricultural waste materials that can really be upcycled and increase their value to make these amino acid based fertilizers, which are very, very favorable for plant growth and development. Actually, yeah. So I have seen some work looking at making a protein hydrolysate from wool. And again, it's particularly the keratin there. And there's special enzymes that will unlock that. They're called keratinases that will break apart those structures in the wool and then liberate the amino acids. And so, yeah, there's probably would be good ways to kind of also make kind of a ferment and a digestion and kind of soak that wool and break it down in a liquid kind of format to turn it into a fully broken down liquid fertilizer that could also be upcycled and made into a very valuable source of amino acid for plant growth and development. So that would be another way. But sure, the way that they're using it is maybe a bit more low tech and easier, just incorporate it into the soil and let the microbes break it down and digest it and bring some of those benefits equally. So that sounds of interest. But yeah, I think there could be some, if you've got a lot of wool at the moment, that could be something to look at in some of these kind of turning it into an amino acid rich fertilizer.
I think this chat it said the wool needed to come off young ewes. So he's actually just running ewe lambs around for a year and he's shearing them twice. And he's using that wool for, I think, as a bit of bedding for the cattle, which then gets broken down obviously into the muck, compost, and then that's incorporated into the fields.
Oh, that's a great idea too. Yeah, use it for some bedding. Yeah, why not? If he needs bedding anyway, then why not use that byproduct as bedding? And that's a perfect way to use it as well. Yeah, so with that manure through the bedding process there, you're going to have an inoculation of lots of microbes and some nutrition and food and things for them to then break down that wool and unlock all those amino acids. That's a really good way to use it too.
And obviously there's lots of people changing to do min-till on the arable side of things rather than actually ploughing. But so I just wondered, is there situations when it's right to do, situations when it's not? And, you hear people saying no steel in the soil, but obviously for some farms, they need to use the plough, and others maybe on different soil types, they maybe don't need to. So I just thought I'd get your ideas on basically, I guess, soil cultivation.
This is one for me that I'll be honest and say, I always seem to flip-flop back and forth between. I can appreciate why it's such a heavily debated question. And I often find myself flip-flopping between different views and different opinions on this, which by the fact that I do that, I guess, is in a way the answer to the question. That I do overall very much support no-till and cyst-based systems, and they make a lot of sense in terms of preserving soil structure, preserving the life in the soil. No one likes their home to be disturbed and dug up and that kind of thing. It's going to be more damaging to the biology. And even from the time and the efficiency and the economics that come with that in terms of being able to do field work and trafficability and that kind of thing so much more quicker and efficiently. And there's diesel and economic savings that come with that. So there's a lot of good reasons why we should be minimizing that disturbance of the soil. And I think that for me, I do sit a little bit in the middle here. as a general rule, I embrace that mantra of minimize. I embrace that word of minimize soil disturbance, because it is a little bit more of an inclusive term that everybody can embrace. Even organic farmers could embrace. They can still work to minimize the disturbance. They may still be using some disturbance, but we're going to try to minimize the number of those disturbances across that rotation, for example. And that's still great. That's still a great step forward. Even if you're not maybe a purist, no-tiller, zero-tiller, you're still working to try and minimize some of those impacts. And so as a general rule, I very much embrace, I think, that specific principle and that mantra. And I guess, the times that I kind of flip-flop a bit to the other side is, I do think about, I'm not opposed to some mechanical intervention. And I think particularly as a strategic action to remediate a symptom, to treat a symptom. And I think that that's how we do need to think about some of these mechanical interventions, that they are not addressing root causes of problems. And that's why I think we do need to be focused in this middle ground between these two extremes of views. Soil cultivations do not address any real root cause of a problem. There's no root cause that is fixed by cultivations. Cultivations help to address a symptom, and that can still be quite okay. The symptom of the soil is some compaction, tight soils, whatever it might be. Look, I'm not opposed to opening up those soils to some strategic cracking open, some subsoiling or lifting, aerating, helping to, in the short term, restructure, get oxygen in. But that is only a symptom treating strategy, which we have to then couple with a root cause remedy, which says, well, why was that soil compacted? Why did it slump together so tightly? The root cause of things like compaction in this example is a lack of roots, a lack of rooting depth that's going to go down and kind of hold that soil open, a lack of soil organic matter, making that soil a bit more spongy and resistant to some of those grazing and machinery load from above. So I'm not opposed, therefore, so I guess my middle ground here is that I'm not opposed to some of that mechanical intervention if soils are genuinely really just so tight and compact that they really just do need a helping hand to crack that open, to alleviate that issue. But we have to then say, okay, well, why did that soil compact so badly? What can I do to prevent that? And so I think that with some of those mechanical interventions, we also need to be thinking about, some other strategic inputs that can help to prevent that from just slumping back together. So again, that would come back to better grazing management, longer rest periods so that the roots have time to get down deeper. So I think that's part of that in that context. And or it could be some of those other rip and drip type approaches where we might drip some amendments, some biostimulants or a bit of biology or some calcium down into that soil as well, just to provide an enticement for those roots to go down and the biology to follow down with those roots. Because it is the roots and the associated biology that really help to stick soil together, to improve that, aggregate that soil and improve that soil structure. So as long as we're coupling, I think, some of those disturbances, with some bit of a longer term thinking and longer term strategies, then I'm not opposed to them, to a bit of mechanical intervention. And I guess I think about, lastly, we think about, looking to nature, this idea of biomimicry and trying to kind of mimic some element of nature's design here. In that context, there are disturbances in nature. They're usually a lot more minimal. They're not quite, well, the big drastic ones is, huge geological activity and tectonic plate upheaval. I mean, this is a big disturbance. So we do see that in nature. And of course, the succession resets from there. But otherwise, even I think that in a natural, on the Great Prairies, for example, in a natural grassland context, let's say, as those animals go through, there is still disturbance at the surface. That hoof is doing a little bit of incorporation at the surface. It is pressing some organic materials down into that soil. And it may not be that it's completely compacting that soil, but it is incorporating a little bit of some of the thatch or residuals, that kind of thing. It is incorporating a little bit of that into the surface of the soil, more of that min-till approach, I guess you would compare that to. So I think when you think about that, there is room, I think, also in nature for, we do observe these kind of minimal type disturbances. There is a bit of disturbance, small amounts of disturbance that can be beneficial. I think it's over disturbance, and it is too frequent disturbances, regular disturbances, very deep, intensive disturbances. These are the things that I think I don't support as much. I think that they are a lot more damaging and problematic. But when we are talking about more strategic and minimal occasional disturbances, then I'm quite open-minded to those, yes.
Okay. And are you excited about the future of farming?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. This whole soil health topic and the regenerative type topic, whatever we want to call these things, agroecology equally, like there seems to be a lot of traction in all of these things, and even conservation agriculture as well. All around the world, there is a lot of traction in these. And I think that central to a lot of those different aspects is this topic of soil. I think they are quite strongly systemically linked through this topic of soil and soil health, and this growing awareness from farmers that, let's be honest, I think going back decades, we did neglect soils. It was kind of just considered a medium that was there to hold the plant up, and we can just, apply inputs and harvest crops and plants and pastures and things. It wasn't seen as such a central core part of the business. But now, with the emergence of the broader, sustainability discussions, I think that's soil health has found its really spot essentially linked to that. We have to have sustainable soil management. We have to have good, healthy soils, because the farm business will not be sustainable without them. Coming back to your very earlier question, yes, soils influence productivity, and that's going to influence profitability. And so yes, I'm excited because I think that with the emergence of all of these kind of new ideas in agriculture at the moment, it is bringing a lot of vigor, a lot of passion and reinterest back into the art of farming. I think that we are seeing a huge shift now. Farming is becoming a lot more fun again. I think it reached a point there where it was, when we're so deep into the calendar type recipe farming system, it gets boring. And then you interject with that the wild weather and climate extremes and whatnot, difficult seasonal growing conditions, it makes that really, really tough. But I think that when you are with this interest that we've seen in recent years and last decade or so in this topic of soil health, it is just so fascinating. It is so interesting. Soil biology, the life in the soil, it's so vast and complex. It's mind-numbing, but that also makes it so interesting, and therefore the potential to reshape, redesign our farming systems to work with biological perspective, to work with biological cycles. It's fun, and it's going to make the system more sustainable. It's going to make it more profitable, and it's going to make it more environmentally friendly. So I'm very excited that at this point in time, we have all of this emerging different ideas around soil management. And, whilst all of these things are emerging, we're going to do what humans do and carry on debating these and talking about whether we need to define regenerative or not, and have all those whatever questions and discussions, which don't really matter. I think what matters is that all of this is emerging, and there's going to be pieces of that puzzle that are going to be more or less applicable to different farmers and different farming contexts. And there's going to be pieces of that puzzle that are going to solidify. There's going to be knowledge gaps, things that will fill in, things that may fall by the wayside. But it's a process. I don't think we have to have everything answered right now and all of the perfect answers and all of this worked out right now. It's going to take another 10, 20 years for some of these kind of really exciting things that are emerging to be refined, and to work out how best to do them and use them, and to do some of these practices and things. But I think for me, the exciting bit is the fact that we are at least on that journey now. I think there is enough momentum down this soil health path that it is an unstoppable force now. And I think that it's really properly integrated, as it should always have been all along. It's properly integrated into the farming consciousness, that importance and value of soil. And now we're just on this journey on filling in all sorts of great knowledge gaps on how best to manage it, to be as efficient as we can, to use less inputs, to take care of that, so to support biodiversity, to support the landscape, the wider landscape and ecological function, and to be productive and profitable all at the same time. So I think that soils are a really important key to that. And as I say, I think my overall feeling is that I'm just excited that we are on that journey, and now we just have to follow it to wherever it's going to take us.
Okay, thank you, Joel. And there's so many different bits and pieces that obviously different farmers can take out of your knowledge that you've given us today. If they only took one piece of advice, what would it be and why?
I think I would have to come back to your question earlier. We talked a little bit about some of those in-field with a spade kind of type assessments. I think I would put this very, very highly because farmers need to prioritize and invest time to go out into their fields and to just dig and observe. If you're not making time in your farming business to do that, and it doesn't have to be every single field every day, obviously, it's, you can choose certain fields, be selective and do that regularly, or, you can mix it around, however farmers want to do that. But again, I will re-emphasize that point about doing relative comparisons. I think that's a really good way to hone your senses. When you look at two different things, you can see different colors, smell different things, feel different textures. They have two relative, very different properties about them that's more easy to observe. I would stress, I think my answer to the question is that activity of going out into a field, assessing soils, communing with your soils, making those kind of basic assessments, just the very act of doing that, it is going to bring you more focused into the importance of that. When you start to see these differences between compacted and not compacted soil, you're going to be more interested. That's going to say, well, why is this more compacted? What can I do about this? What's happening over here? Digging under the hedgerows, digging in the, these types of relative comparisons. I think that this is just a really good thing that all farmers should be doing. And I think that through doing that, it can be an important catalyst for that deeper and deeper interest in the topic of soils. And that's how you're going to then answer your other question in terms of like, well, how do I interpret the soil test? How do I understand it? How do I know what to do? The only way farmers are going to be able to do that, sure, they can seek out advice and things, and that's okay too. But the only way that they're going to really answer that bigger question of interpreting a soil test and understanding that soil test is through their own education. And again, it comes back to that importance of you've got to be interested in a topic. And if you're interested in something, you're going to find it easier to educate yourself about it, to read about it, to learn about it, if you find it interesting. And that's why I think that going out into the field and having a dig with some of those spade tests and basic in-field assessments, they're a way to spark your interest, because when you visually, tangibly see and feel things, that's going to be a bit more of interest to you to kind of understand, well, the why behind that. Why are these different? Why does it look like that? And that's going to start you on that soil learning journey. I think my biggest advice is that one. Get out in the field and have a dig and do this regularly and check things. Devote that time. I think it might unlock a little bit of the deeper passion or interest in that topic of soils. And that's going to spur you on to further your education, to read up more about interpreting soil tests, or go along to more courses, meet with more farmers, and kind of try and answer those questions and fill in some of those blanks. So I think that's my answer. I would just encourage farmers to get out there and have a dig, have a sniff, have a look, and go from there.
Thank you very much, Joel. So really it's about getting back to the basics and knowing what your soils are doing, finding what your biggest limitation is, and then obviously finding out what you need to do from there. I need to go and learn a bit more about calcium and infiltration tests, because those are things that I haven't learned much about in the past. So I will go and read up on those myself. But thank you very much, Joel, for your time this afternoon. And I hope everybody's got something out of this, those that have listened to it. So thank you very much for your time, Joel. And obviously we can pop your details on there. And if anyone's got any further questions, I guess they can ask away, or we can put links to your website, because I know you run different courses as well, don't you, Joel?
Yep, that's right. On my website, I do have a resources page, which has also got all sorts of articles and things about soils that I've written and stuff written about me and my work. So there's some starter reading information there if anyone's interested. And yeah, otherwise I do have some online courses, and people can sign up to my mailing list. There's a bit of info there that might signpost and help people along their journey.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joel. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.